it's interesting how racism and injustice and inequity replicates itself globally across people's bodies and within our communities. So next, I would love, it's my distinct honor to welcome Dr. Magda Matache is a lecturer on social and behavioral sciences at the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Chan School here at Harvard. She is the co-founder and director of the Roma program at FXB Center. And she is also a member of the Lancet Commission on Reparations and Redistribute Justice and the O'Neill Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health. Please join me in welcoming.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see you all at the end of this amazing day. And thank you so much, Keisha. What a wonderful blessing to have you as the MC, the narrator, the storyteller of our 11th Roma conference. I and all of us are very grateful to you. It is also a great honor to contribute concluding remarks to our own annual Roma conference, mainly because the topic of health is not only fundamental and critical, but also because public health has been traditionally used as a weapon and a tool in processes of racialization, violence, segregation against the Roma people. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank our panelists, discussants, and moderators for their contribution to this necessary and pressing dialogue. And I'll try to grasp a bit from the richness and the depth of your ideas, wisdoms, concerns, scholarship, and activism. So in my remarks, I'll touch upon two big topics discussed throughout the day. First, the nexus between anti-Roma racism and health, and second, epistemic violence in Roma health research. And please allow me to start with the nexus between anti-Roma racism and health. As Martin and Lois underlined, across Europe, the Roma people experience worse health outcomes than the majority populations. That mirrors the situation of racialized and minority groups in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and so on, as David Williams explained this afternoon. Across the European Union countries, and Martin mentioned recent data, Roma women live 11 years less than the majority, than the white women. And in the Czech Republic, as Petra added, Roma people die 18 years earlier in the poorest neighborhoods. Essentially, as Mary Bassett alluded to, Roma people are condemned to live shorter and sicker lives. Moreover, in Romania, and Carmen thoroughly talked about it, Roma women do not have the power over their own bodies, particularly in relation to medical doctors, as she explained. And in fact, many do not even go to a hospital unless they have to, because of racist, classist, homophobic behaviors they often encounter in public hospitals. To date, I dare to say that no government has taken an anti-racist approach to tackle health inequities. And in fact, as Martin underlined, health education campaigns and health mediators and Roma nurses are seen as the panaceas of solving problems in Roma communities. But again, as Martin underlined, not to combat or address racism, but rather they are often seen as tools to address what I think the European, the graduate world calls Roma lifestyles, Roma behaviors, Roma habits. And in fact, addressing the structural elements of Roma's oppression is more or less a taboo or a neglected policy agenda. the academic world has long fed and contributed to such approaches and has often framed Roma people's health, bodies, and disease in a dominant, supremacist, and racializing manner. As we've learned from our presentations today, research as much as policymakers have generally and consistently used three approaches to unpack differential health outcomes or for some other purposes, a genetic, a social Darwinist, and a poverty approach. And I'm very much aware that categories may limit and narrow our conversations, but for the purpose of this summary, I'll try to use these three categories. Veronica and Marius touched upon the genetic approach quite a bit. And looking at various genetic studies throughout centuries, we can see that the assumption that Roma people are biologically, genetically different than their white counterparts has served at least two purposes so far. One, to inquire, prove, or identify racial genetic differences. And Veronica, you talked about that, and two, to predict or explain health disparities. And we may recall and remember from our past that mirroring the ideology of the master or the superior race and the centrality of race purity during the 20th century, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany collected and analyzed blood samples from Roma and Sinti people to identify racial differences in infectious diseases, and also to study what they called eye anomalies. Their studies involved injecting Roma and Sinti twins with typhus and killing twins with heterochromatic eyes. Legacies of scientific racism or biological and cultural determinism can be observed in contemporary research, underlying biological differences or a lifestyle as causes of disease and inequities. In fact, that happens in practice too, right? Petra explained examples of medical doctors who see and address mental illness as a genetic problem of the Roma people. But back to research, Veronica mentioned and also concluded in her 2019 Nature article co-authored with Mihai Surdu and others, that in many genetic studies, researchers connect words like gypsies and inbred and describe Roma people as a genetic high-risk group. At the same time, several studies, quite recent, I would say, explore metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, or even leisure physical activities. And we talked about this last night, you know, that I'm interested in the topic. They explored this topic, but also made some concerning and unscientific conclusions. In some of these journal articles, the authors did acknowledge that there is an impact that social and economic factors have on differences and disparities between Roma and non-Roma people. Yet they also learned that Roma people experience health disparities even when analysis controlled for social and economic factors. So how did these academic papers explain the role of ethnicity in disease disparities? They pointed to a need for a better account of traditions, lifestyles, beliefs, and cultural and genetic differences between Roma and non-Roma, but not for the ways and the methods in which we could actually measure different features of anti-Roma racism and its historical, continuous, interactional features and its intersection with other systems of oppression, like including patriarchy, homophobia, and classism. And Carmen alluded to that in her presentation as well. And sometimes Roma nurses and activists and others also internalize and put into practice that discourse. And Petra, you offered us a few examples in that sense. Another related pattern in research, but also policymaking, is this constant and overwhelming focus on the so-called communicable diseases, and essentially the spread of disease in or from Roma communities. Ioannida, Dale, and Marius and Joanna offered us examples of institutional measures concerning various epidemics during slavery and the Holocaust, or the immigration or refugee related measures in Europe and the United States. The discourse of these gypsies must go. They are the menace to the health and peace of our community, which Dylan explained, has repeated time and time again in Europe and in the United States, but in different forms and in different spaces. And as Steve Hagioff and Martin McKee underlined in an earlier systematic review of the research on the Roma people's health, and Lois thoroughly addressed it in her presentation today. In this context, the idea and the focus on contagion alludes to a sort of a social Darwinist approach, reflecting more a preoccupation with the health of the non-Roma. And a fear of contagion from the Roma people, a people considered socially undesirable and dangerous, a people considered a menace to public health, as many of you, including Ioannida, mentioned in your presentations. And finally, another approach in research has been the focus on income poverty as a major source of disease and inequities. And David Williams has long evidenced the social and economic status of various communities as a causal pathway that links race and ethnicity to health. Yet health disparities between Roma and non-Roma people continue after income poverty is controlled. And instead of justifying the gap through the language of bad genes and lifestyles, the scholarship does need to invest in measuring life course adversity. And Nancy talked for a bit about it, being it social, economic, or psychological, as well as structural racism and the experience of everyday discrimination, or you can call it everyday racism, and other psychosocial barriers. Essentially, in my opinion, one of the ways forward includes scholarship on how anti-Roma racism in various forms, from structural to individual and behavioral, has shaped health outcomes and health inequities between Roma and non-Roma. As we underlined in the concept of this conference, and many of you talked about it today, more research is necessary to understand the historical foundations of inequities and the legacies of slavery, the gypsy hunts, genocides, forced assimilation, and so on. And as David Williams, Alexandra Opera, Nancy Krieger, and Marius Turda underline, we can better understand racism today only if we understand the specific history of a racialized group, in our case, Roma, the history of eugenics, and racism as a global and enduring edifice. For instance, many Roma families and communities across Europe live in poorly resourced and residentially segregated communities, a legacy of both past and present measures. Thus, in many ways, we must understand and measure the nexus between residential segregation or systemic disinvestment in poor Roma neighborhoods and Roma health, including cardiovascular disease, if you were to think about, or even cancer. Academia needs to be able to answer in a non-racist, non-biased, participatory, collaborative, and when possible, Roma-led manner to many questions. For instance, does living in segregated Roma neighborhoods and dealing with racial and class discrimination have a biopsychosocial effect on Roma people? Who is benefiting from health injustices, as Nancy suggested earlier? essentially environmental, intersectional, eco-social, multidimensional, multi-level, and anti-racist approaches and frameworks. All of you mentioned these words, and these approaches should be added to or should replace some of the existing research models. I'll stop here, although your contributions have been far more thought-provoking and fascinating. But I want to take one more minute, Kisha, with your permission, to thank all our partners for their support in organizing this conference, and thank the FXB team for their trust and support. So thank you, Mary. Thank you, Natalia, Kisha, Edita, Gerlind, Vlad, and our volunteers today, Amy, Rebecca, Ricardo, and all of you. Nevertheless, I do want to end by thanking Claire and Denai. I don't see them here. The great minds, the brilliant friends, and the unseen forces and faces behind this event. Earlier today, Sarah asked me if I felt stressed, and I said no. And I realized that it was the first time when I gave that answer in 11 years at the beginning of the Roma conference. And that is because of you, Dinay and Claire. So please, all of you, let's give them a big round of applause. And with that, back to you, Kisha. Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you so much, Magda. This conference has been amazing, and sort of just infuses, I hope, has infused all of us with the energy to realize that we can take scholarship and our creativity, that we have to bring in the creativity with the scholarship, with storytelling, to create a counter narrative. I have a friend who's an activist, and she said, racism is so not creative. It lacks creativity. And it really does. As a fiction writer, it's cliche, actually. Like, you don't use racism to push the narrative forward, but it's harnessed to erase. And so we have to, as I sat here listening, like I said, I could sit here for days. I'm going to Google everyone's research, get some books, to think about the creativity that we need to bring forward. And this conference is a part of that, and the global effort, and connecting the global erasure of bodies through these hegemonic narratives and tools of violence. So next, I would like to, I found a little connection. Next, I would like to bring up Dr. Marius Turda, who will talk more about the exhibit that's out in the hall, We Are Not Alone, Legacies of Eugenics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Turda.
Okay, I hope you could bear with me for another 5 minutes or possibly 7 minutes. I know we have had a long day and we're all looking forward to the reception. And tomorrow at 5 o'clock, I give a proper lecture at BU on eugenics. So if you are interested, do come along, please. So I just want to say a few words really about how important this is to me. And I think it is important to all of us here to discuss the global legacies of eugenics. And indeed, eugenics was global. That's very important. But I don't think we'll ever know the full extent of its impact. Probably we'll never know. We'll never know because many people do not come forward. It's a shame in the family to admit your aunt or your mother or your grandmother was sterilized. So we're fighting not only historical records, historical memory, we're fighting personal traumas. So we'll never know how deep it cut into the texture of our modern life. But we know it cut deep. and white. So I think it is imperative that we engage with these legacies, and we have to reclaim at the same time the academic and the cultural and the social spaces eugenics occupy for so long. It's not simply to go against the trend, to criticize a historical legacy. We need to reclaim the space it occupied for so long. We mentioned Harvard eugenicists. They occupied amazing academic positions. And we know universities in the US and the UK and Europe were run and founded by very prominent scientists, and they occupied positions. They shared wealth and power, and they passed on their prestige and status to their generations of students. So how do we reclaim this back? Historically speaking, it is important to know about various moments in the history of eugenics. But ultimately, it is the legacies which are problematic because they remain so powerful in our lives. Now, over the past 30 years, scholars of various orientations, so not just historians, but philosophers, bioethicists, legal scholars, philosophers, have tried to offer this historically informed account of eugenics. They have determined the ebb and flow of the eugenic movements across the world. And now we actually know, I mean, even I know about almost every single country in the world, how many societies there were, how the eugenic movements was organized. Obviously, 25 years ago, we didn't know that. We didn't know anything about Eastern Europe, for example, when I started researching this. But now we know. But ultimately, the question remains, well, what do we do with this historical information? We're just adding another sort of chapter or another drawer to the cupboard. So now we have the history of eugenics in Greece. So what's that all about? So we can't speak about the invisibility of eugenics, historically speaking, because now all the historical movements have come out of their shell. We know it. It's not just Nazi Germany, and it's not just the UK, it's not just the US. In 2021, to commemorate a century since the Second International Eugenic Congress, which was held in New York, I curated this exhibition, which is entitled "We Are Not Alone: Legacies of Eugenics." And those of you familiarized with German eugenic movement would have recognized the poster, because obviously there's a powerful message being passed on by the poster itself, which is the Nazi poster from 1936, which basically says, we are just the vanguard, but everyone is doing the same thing. We're just courageous. We just accept. We just want push forward an agenda. So the Nazis were very good at communicating this message across the world. Also, eugenicists themselves were avid communicators. They knew how to play popular feelings. They knew how to speak to everyone. They knew how to address the person in the corner. Bless you. And that's crucially important, because what I did, I wanted to use the same strategy they employed, the same methodology to turn it upside down. So if the eugenicists are avid communicators, we anti-eugenicists should be avid communicators. We should use that to really project the image forward. And we have two tapestries in the exhibition, which I received from an important Abenaki French American artist who created this perspective in the mirror. So you have the eugenic tree, which is the symbol of the eugenic movement. And she created what you could see in the mirror, an anti-eugenic tree, a witness tree, which suggests that if eugenics is about stigmatizing, it's about separating, it's about creating hierarchies, the anti-eugenics should be about bringing us together as branches of one tree. As one of the person I spoke to, a victim of sterilization in Japan, told me, and he sent me this wonderful photo, which I included in the exhibition. And he told me something superbly nice. He said, if you fight together, you're like a chopstick, they could break you. But if we are together, we're like a tree, and they can't break the tree. And the tree is a powerful symbol, also because it was used recurrently by any supremacist and nationalist movement. You have the oak tree. We defend ourselves. We are the tree. We have to protect the weeds growing on us. But also is the fact that we cut the eugenic tree, at least we thought we cut the eugenic trees in 1945, 1950s when we defeated Nazism and after the Holocaust. What we didn't see, and this is what I was trying to do in the exhibition, we didn't see the roots. We cut the tree, but we didn't extract the roots. And the roots continued, to grow all the way through the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And they would just flourish every now and then. And we see this when we hear cases, another Latino woman was sterilized, another Black woman was sterilized, another indigenous person in Peru was sterilized, another Roma woman was sterilized. And we realize those roots have the capacity to really spring back to life. So we created this exhibition and we went to Poland, we went to Sweden, Romania, and it is here in the USA now. So that's quite important to me, because I think the US looms very large in British imagination, also European imagination, in terms of racism and eugenics. It's always believed, of course, that we weren't as bad as the Americans. So that's quite important, because many will say, well, yes, of course we had the eugenic movement, but I mean, the true racists are in America, or the true racists were the Nazis. So it's very important actually to really force that narrative to dislodge it out of its kind of path. Because Europeans, regrettably, and the British in particular, they have a misplaced, I think, sense of intellectual superiority on issues of racial and eugenic justice. And we haven't made significant progress in the UK comparing to the US, considering, of course, that the very word eugenics was coined by a British eugenicist, right? A famous Victorian polymath, Francis Galton, in 1883. He was a half cousin of Charles Darwin. So we have this responsibility somehow to explain this, and then, of course, to allow for the elaboration how it moved across the world. Have eugenic congresses organized in 1912 in London, attended by 400 people, including some, very famous would-be politicians, such as Winston Churchill. Right? He was there. So an absolute icon in British imagination. And then, of course, America takes over as they have the Second International Congress in New York, and then the third one, 1921, New York again, 1932. So that's one thing. But there's another aspect of the exhibition I want to highlight with your permission. It's basically how can we confront these legacies? And we talked about, genetics and genomics, and certainly the possibility of genetic manipulation of human traits alert us to a new version of eugenics. And those of us who read the literature on genomics and genetic manipulation and gene editing, we could see that actually the discussion now is not about feeble-minded people or criminality and so on, which was the case during the first part of the 20th century, but on genetic diseases. It's about the Down syndrome now. Can we eliminate Down syndrome completely, or chromosome disorders or single gene mutations? So there's an entire literature being built around it. So of course the eugenic gaze shifts it, of course, but ultimately I think the aim is still the same. We want to control reproductive practices of certain individuals and certain groups. And in this way, we try to influence the transmission of what we call today unwanted hereditary traits. So we ought to be alert in any case. So even if you're not interested historically in what happened, but you are interested in how the conversation moves across today, you would be slightly, amazed if you weren't to pay attention to the history of eugenics. Finally, I think the exhibition and the conferences it went to, like this one, and went to another Romani conference that Marton and Magda organized in Sweden. I think these are amazing way of crossing the bridge, as I say, because ultimately this is not an academic conversation, and the exhibition is not addressed to scholars of eugenics, but actually how do we get out of the confines of seminars and lecture rooms, and we actually speak to the public, speak to the people on the street, as it were. And this is not easy, because obviously It's extremely delicate. It's controversial. People could hijack the conversation very easily because, of course, you start talking about eugenics, and some of them, it happened many times. The first 5 minutes, they thought, "Oh, finally, someone is coming and saying something about eugenics." I always wanted to, like, I'm such a big supporter. Then, of course, like after 5 minutes, they realize, "Oh God, this guy is criticizing eugenics." So you could see them like trying to, because of course they know something about it. They know it's important, but how do we get to actually debate it publicly? And that's very difficult, I think, particularly for people in academia who don't have the kind of language to really do it properly, I think. And we have to learn from activists, we have to learn from lawyers, we have to be community people who actually do this work, real work, not just behind sort of library shelves. When you look at the discrimination going on today, it's absolutely appalling, because obviously it's not just based on race. We spoke about race today, but it's actually class, particularly in the West, particularly in the US and England. It is a great deal about social status, about class. Poor people, problem families. Poverty is interpreted in a biologically deterministic way, as Nancy said. And I always go and say you cannot find a solution to a social problem by invoking genetics. The solution to poverty is not eugenics. It's not by stopping these people from reproducing. You have to invest in improving, so on and so forth. And it's about disability. We haven't but briefly touched that. But ultimately, eugenicists are really obsessed with what we call today disability, learning disabilities, not just physical disability, but learning disabilities. And that really cuts across, because you could have someone who's feeble-minded, as it was called at the time, but you could also have someone who is a woman, has a child out of the wedlock, or she's too young to have a child, then we sterilize her because obviously she's not able to think with her own mind. So how do you construct that and you discuss it? And then, of course, age is very important. We saw this with COVID. Older people were immediately targeted for, they're going to die anyway. So why not push them slower but gentler down the stairs? So we all have the ability, I think, to make the right choice and reject, of course, eugenics and its false promises of human improvement. And our scholarly work must reorient itself to on anti-eugenics and anti-racism. It's not enough to say, well, I'm not a racist. You need to be more actively, consciously believing in your work as an anti-racist. A lot of us, I think, genuinely believe we're not racist, or certainly we're not supporting eugenics. But it turns out, and we look back at what happened for the past 15 years in Western democracies, just being, indifferent or simply saying, well, I'm not getting involved, is regrettably not a solution anymore. So to educate about eugenics, as we try to do, and about racism, and we try to do with the exhibition, to engage with it, and to condemn it publicly, are all essential components of our efforts to understand the hidden and very difficult past, whilst we work towards a fairer and more just society. We can only remove the global roots of eugenics through both personal and collective reckoning with the wrongs of its history. Thank you. Now, I know we're about to leave, and I'm not going to say anything, but I very kindly asked Nancy to say a few words, and I want to share this platform with Nancy Krieger, because not only I greatly admire her work, but also because I think it would be good to have another perspective for a minute or so without imposing on your time, Magda, please. With your permission, ladies and gentlemen, Nancy Krieger.
I think it's so important and wonderful that this exhibit is here, and that I hope we can at Harvard take full advantage of it and its presence. And I just want to say that one thing, as teaching about eugenics, which I do in all three courses that I teach here, it's crucial knowledge. It's crucial knowledge to understand that there are people who consider themselves to be progressive who supported eugenics, not just people who might be labeled as quote unquote politically reactionary. And for students here, and I don't know how it is for those of you who teach at other institutions, knowing the role of your own institution. So for me, teaching about people at Harvard is particularly important because people go, oh, wait, this is this university. How do I carry on what I do with the training I get here to make it a different world? And that's really possible. So there's also a thanks to the historians that have been doing the archival work that allow us to point to the histories that combine histories of eugenics and anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous thought in the United States and anti-immigrant thought. And important to remember that the longest serving president of Harvard, Charles Eliot, was key in the anti-immigration legislation that was passed, the Immigration Restriction Act, 1924 and 1927. And Harvard had key support for the eugenicist that went on, Davenport. He was here in the biology department before he went on to Cold Spring Harbor, and he founded the Eugenics Records Office. So it's really an important part of understanding, and then above all, the continued seduction of genetic explanations as now emphasized in quote unquote precision medicine and being replicated in even in more insidious frames of quote unquote precision public health. So I just think that people can be incredibly precise in their incredibly incorrect assumptions that inequities come from within people's bodies and not the body politic. And that's what this shows. And this also exhibit on eugenics and the work I've followed a lot of the conference that was done last year, looking at the 100th year anniversary of the Second International Congress. These are the most educated people. This is not a matter of ignorance. So what are they doing with their education? And what property and interests are they supporting? That's always got to be the first question asked.
Thank you so much. I don't know about the rest of you, but I am activated. Thank you. We have a reception. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to let you go. So the reception, everyone is welcome. And I hope we can continue these conversations, not only in the next hour, but for the days to come. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure.